think the Russians are also moving some forces over the river that are now in and around Odessa. I was told yesterday that Russian special operations forces roam freely during the night around Odessa and in Kiev because you have these long periods where you have no illumination, no lighting, no energy for it. And so they can put on their night vision devices and wander around without interference. I think this whole thing is coming to a very tragic but predictable end. And I think the Russians are concerned now with what happens as this thing crumbles. Now, they can't force the Europeans to do much, but I think the Europeans are foolish to believe that there's anything they can do to influence the outcome other than be willing to sit down and talk to the Russians. The most interesting aspect of this whole thing is now this new national security document that's come out, which has no strategy per se. It's simply a set of assertions. And the assertion that is most troubling to the Europeans is the recognition that we're not going to stay in Europe in perpetuity.
The darkness over Odessa and Kiev signals more than a blackout. It marks the moment a nation loses control of its own nights. As Russian forces move freely, the war shifts from borders to the heart of daily life. The collapse unfolding now was warned about, yet pushed aside until it became unavoidable. Europe still imagines it can shape the outcome, but influence without power quickly fades. Negotiation is the only path left, though each delay narrows the options. Even Washington now hints it won't remain Europe's shield forever, and when that reality lands, the continent's entire strategic foundation will begin to fracture.
I don't think there's a great deal that President Trump can do. I don't think there ever was. This was one of the criticisms I had with the dithering over the last 12 months. In fact, before he was elected, I was suggesting strongly that once he was elected to the presidency and was inaugurated, that he should begin the process of disengaging. There's not much that can be done at this point. The opportunity for Washington leading NATO in a different direction was lost back in 2022 when the first opportunity came in the form of an agreement reached in Turkey, in Istanbul. That was rejected out of hand. Subsequent discussions were all meaningless because everyone was convinced that Russia, given enough time, would fall apart, that Russia was weak, the government would not stand, that Putin was the evil dictator that under these circumstances would be willingly removed by his population. Well, it's all nonsense. But we stuck with this mantra, and even after Trump began to sober up in the run-up to his election, once he was in office, he began repeating all the lies that had become standard in NATO and across the West that were prevalent in the media.
The tragedy here is that the window for meaningful action closed long before anyone in Washington realized it. The hesitation, the wishful thinking, the belief that time itself would weaken Russia, all of it created today's dead end. The Istanbul Agreement was the moment to pivot toward peace, yet it was dismissed with arrogance. From that point onward, every diplomatic effort became theater, not strategy. Western leaders convinced themselves that Russia would collapse if they simply waited long enough. But nations don't crumble on fantasy timelines crafted in foreign capitals. And now the cost of that miscalculation is a conflict no one can steer and no one knows how to end.
The outrageous claims of heavy Russian casualties when the Russians were taking casualties, but they weren't the heavy ones. The heavy casualties were being taken by the Ukrainians. I mean, you just had a debate and touched on some of these subjects with this British, I guess he was an admiral. I don't remember. Was he an admiral or a general? People are still living in fantasy world here in the United States and in Western Europe. The average American knows that things aren't going well economically, but a sledgehammer is coming at you, but until it finally hits you over the head, you don't really understand what it means. I think that's kind of where we are with everything right now in the West. We're in a funk, as they say, a twilight zone between reality and fantasy. Reality is coming. You can see it. It's like looking at a train that's coming down the tracks, a locomotive. It's headed for you. But until it arrives at the station, you're suspicious.
The narrative about Russian losses was always a distraction from the far heavier toll Ukraine was actually paying, yet Western officials kept selling illusions, as if denial could substitute for strategy. Debates with retired admirals and generals only exposed how deeply the fantasy still runs. People sense something is wrong, but they haven't felt the full impact yet. It's like watching a sledgehammer swing toward you in slow motion, refusing to believe it will land. The West is drifting in a twilight zone, caught between comfort and collapse, and the moment of impact, the moment reality finally arrives, is closing in fast.
Focus on the Western Hemisphere, where we want to be dominant. Okay, well, we are already dominant in the Western Hemisphere, but apparently somebody's decided we need to invade Venezuela to demonstrate just how dominant we are, which I think is a very dumb idea, but that's prevalent in Washington. We have to signal to everyone that this is our hemisphere, we're in charge. And then you say to them, well, have you talked to Moscow and Beijing? Well, what do you mean? I said, well, they seem to think they're dominant in Asia and dominant in Eurasia and Europe. Have you talked to them about their interests? No. Where everything is done in isolation here in Washington from what happens anywhere else. We're not really taking those things into consideration. The only good part of this is Trump's personal input. Now, what is Donald Trump's personal input? First of all, it's we're not paying for NATO anymore.
Washington's obsession with proving dominance in the Western Hemisphere reveals a mindset trapped in the past. Invading Venezuela isn't strategy, it's insecurity dressed up as strength. What's stunning is how little consideration is given to Moscow or Beijing, who view Asia and Eurasia as their spheres of influence. Great powers talk, insecure powers posture, yet Washington continues making decisions in a vacuum, blind to how the world has already shifted. This isolation isn't strategic independence, it's strategic ignorance. And ironically, the only restraint in this entire equation comes from Trump's refusal to keep bankrolling NATO.
No discussion of how you move through some sort of process to Europeanize NATO. Well, it's probably irrelevant because I don't think Europe is going to retain NATO. There was a point in time in the 90s when you could have had a Europeanization. But now Europe is fiercely divided. It was always difficult to move as one. Moving Europeans collectively in a direction, sort of like herding cats. It's not going to happen. So you're going to end up with new security arrangements across the continent. Russia is going to play a role in that, whether we like it or not. So what's the long-term strategic focus and forecast other than we want to be dominant in the Western Hemisphere? We're no longer apparently preparing for war against China, at least not based upon what I read. And we no longer really want to go to war with Russia, based upon the sort of assertions that I read in the document. That's not a strategy, Glenn. That's just an expression of preference.
Europe had a brief window in the 90s to reshape NATO into a truly European structure, but that moment is long gone. The continent is now too divided, too fragmented, too politically brittle to act as one. New security arrangements are inevitable, and Russia will be part of them whether anyone in the West approves or not. Yet Washington still clings to a worldview centered solely on dominance in its own hemisphere. The strategic horizon has narrowed, not expanded. Avoiding war with China and avoiding war with Russia is not a strategy, it's a wish. What we're seeing now is not foresight, but a list of preferences masquerading as policy.
Not a strategy. The strategy is if you're going to disengage from the Ukraine debacle, how do you do it? He's always taken the position, I think, in his mind, that he's at the center of the universe, that he is the leader of the greatest, most powerful force on earth. Okay, sounds good. It's not true, but that's what people believe. So what do? You summon all of the European vassal state leaders to the White House. They all sit around in front of you and wait for you to express your views, and then they try to lobby you for whatever it is that they want. That's not really how you do business. If you want to put forward an idea, you have to have a strategic framework. That's why I see none at all. How do we end up disengaging from Ukraine and simultaneously preparing to invade Venezuela? I mean, somebody said, well, we've been trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela now for at least 20 years.
The real question isn't whether disengagement from Ukraine should happen, It's how a superpower pulls back without exposing the emptiness of its own strategy. When leadership treats itself as the center of the universe, it mistakes theatrics for statecraft. Summoning European leaders to Washington may look powerful, but it's not a framework, it's a performance. A genuine plan requires structure, sequencing, and clarity, none of which exist right now. Washington is trying to exit one conflict while entertaining fantasies of starting another in Venezuela. That isn't strategy, it's geopolitical whiplash, and it reveals a government acting on impulse, not on coherent long-term vision.
See any plan. I don't see any strategy. And I think the Europeans have a right to be frustrated by that. But keep in mind that they haven't been helpful. Just as they have taken a position that you have to fight to the last Ukrainian, defend every inch of ground, return everything to Ukraine. They pretended this Ukraine construct was always something much more than it was. Ukraine's never been a nation state. This was just a construct created by Lenin to satisfy the needs of the Soviet state system, which he devised to enhance Bolshevik control and influence. Now, it doesn't mean there were no Ukrainians. It doesn't mean there aren't Ukrainians. But the point is, nobody has sat down and looked at this thing objectively and said, well, how do we sort this child? How do we come out of this? How do we avoid future conflict? It's as though everyone wants perpetual conflict. And I think you can make an argument for that. The ruling globalist class in Europe wants conflict against Russia.
Europe's frustration is justified because they're following a leader with no strategy while offering none of their own. For years, they pushed the illusion of fighting to the last Ukrainian, refusing to accept the limits of reality. Ukraine was treated as a sacred construct, not the fragile political project it has always been. No one stopped to ask the basic questions: what is the end state? What is sustainable? What prevents the next war? Objective analysis was replaced by emotion, ideology, and wishful thinking. It's as if perpetual conflict became more desirable than negotiated stability, and at the center of it all is a globalist class that sees confrontation with Russia not as a burden, but as a feature.
I think most Americans are even remotely connected to Europe from a purely national security standpoint. Most of them don't know anything about NATO. Most are not aware of the distribution of our armed forces all the way around the world. I mean, they know they're out there, but beyond that, they don't know much about it. The war machine that we built is largely gone rogue. It has continued to expand and increase itself without much consultation with the American people, and the American people haven't been engaged. So I think there are two sides to this. You have a lot of people in my generation and older who are horrified, who believe that if the Europeans are not somehow or another stabilized by our political, military, and economic influence, that they will fall out with each other and go back to war. Literally, there are people that believe that we have this long-term interest in helping Europe avoid that, and that we somehow or another have to herd the cat.
Most Americans feel no real connection to Europe, and that distance shapes their indifference to NATO. They sense U.S. forces are scattered across the world, but they have no idea why or to what end. A war machine built decades ago now operates with almost no public oversight or consent. Generations who lived through past conflicts still cling to the belief that America must stabilize Europe. They fear that without U.S. supervision, Europeans will turn on each other again. But that mindset traps us in outdated obligations that no longer reflect today's realities. And the result is a foreign policy running on momentum, not genuine national interest.
The Europeans have taken a very unhealthy approach, and that approach has been to emulate us, try to imitate our foolishness in so many ways. I don't think the massive migration that came out of North Africa and the Middle East that started in 2015 would have occurred if we were not in Europe. I think the Europeans would have defended their borders. I think they would have defended their countries, their culture, their civilization. And that's part of what I think Donald Trump was trying to say in this national security document. We have advertised ourselves as the model for everyone else. Just look at us. We're so fortunate. We have this wonderful economy, and oh, by the way, we have all these different people from all these different places, and we're all harmonious, love each other, and get along. Well, that's not true. Anybody who spends any time in the United States and really knows the place knows that we are very seriously divided along many lines: cultural, racial, ethnic, religious. So the notion that we're some sort of paradise where everyone magically leaves their unhappiness and baggage at the door, enters into the United States, and lives in paradise is wrong.
Europe's greatest mistake has been trying to imitate Washington's worst ideas instead of defending its own interests. Had the US not been embedded so deeply in Europe, the 2015 migration wave might have been met with real border protection. European leaders abandoned cultural self-preservation in favor of copying America's ideological experiments. Meanwhile, the US keeps selling itself as a flawless multicultural model that the rest of the world should follow. But anyone who truly knows America understands how deep the social, cultural, and racial fractures run. This isn't a harmonious utopia, it's a nation struggling to hold itself together. Yet Europe imported the myth without questioning the reality behind it.